All right, so we're going to talk about topicality today as another one of our big nat-circuit type arguments. This one is going to be very similar to the ones we did on theory, in like the structure in which it has. So you should definitely go watch that one first. And hopefully, even if you just watch that one, it'll also give a bit more clarity as we kind of talk about the general ideas again. Um, but topicality, otherwise known as T, is these types of arguments that are similar to theory in the way that's like you're kind of breaking the rules of debate, but to a lesser extent on like the actual unspoken rules and more focused on the idea that you simply aren't following the resolution, hence the term. You aren't following the topic. Because resolutions obviously are worded in a very specific way, and the ways in which they're worded are going to result in different arguments. And if the arguments don't fit under those wordings, then that's reasons that we shouldn't be accepting those types of arguments. Even if it may seem like semantics that a certain argument isn't going to be accepted under like an interpretation of a resolution, if that's how the resolution is worded, then that means that we have to use only arguments that can fit that resolution. Now, generally on like traditional debates, this is very easy to point out because if people are bringing up untopical arguments, it's pretty clear, and the judges aren't going to really let that fly. If you simply say like this doesn't fall under the resolution, then that's probably all you really need to do. But on the nat circuit, as with most things, they have a very structured way to determine how we should be handling an issue where someone is presenting arguments that are not topical, which is what topicality is. It's the way in which we handle those different types of arguments, which also makes it a lot easier to respond to topicality if it's ran against you. Because in traditional debate, you can just be like, yeah, it is topical, but like there's not a whole lot more you can say to that. So this kind of gives us a lot more forums of what to do if we have those arguments ran against us within the national circuit. So let's go and actually look at how we structure these arguments and how we can respond to them. So as with theory, we're just going to go like bit by bit and kind of show the different types of or parts of the argument of topicality. They're going to be very similar to theory, so you'll definitely see some familiar faces. So the first is going to be interpretation once again. And similar to how we were like interpreting rules in theory, this is an interpretation of the resolution itself. Generally, this is going to fall under one or two terms in the resolution, like one term of art, and you're going to define it. The best thing you can do for these definitions, is going to come from topic literature. Like a specific art, we'll say, like as an example, an article specifically talking about like for the new topic, lethal autonomous weapons, instead of just a definition from Merriam-Webster. Those definitions are going to be a lot stronger because they're obviously related to what we're talking about. Additionally, your definition should be both inclusive and exclusive. So, for instance, you should define what the term means and also what it doesn't mean. So, for lethal autonomous weapons, if we find one that says that it's any machine that can go and seek out and kill human targets without human interaction, then that's very good for inclusivity. But it would also be nice if it was literally just like, it is not drones. That makes it easy. And that's an example of exclusivity and how that's going to definitely help us. So running with that example, if we provide that definition and we say that our opponent's arguments doesn't meet it, then we're going to next go into our violation and simply say that. We're going to argue that what our opponent is saying does not meet our definition or interpretation of the resolution. If you can read a card here, that'd be great. That would be like an example of what they're reading is untopical. But yeah, simply if you have something from an author that specifically says we exclude this like type of argument, that's going to be the best thing you can do. So if we say under lethal autonomous weapons that we exclude drones, and if our opponent is running an argument saying that like based off drones, then we can say no, that argument's not topical because it doesn't like count as a lethal autonomous weapon anyway. So that'd be your violation. Drones are not lethal autonomous weapons. And then lastly, we move to our standards and like reasons to prefer again. And these are still similar to theory. We have our same ones such as like limits and textuality and topic lit. And all these big ideas are essentially like why the argument they're running is bad and like how it's going to be harming our debate. and how like the violation is going to change the grounds of the debate. So a lot of it is going to be things such as like time skew or like research burden or simply that like ground and how it makes it hard for us to respond. All these ideas that we already talked about before, but now like as a standard for why them violating the topic is bad. And truly, there's not too much else more topicality other than that. Topicality is definitely a like more simple one. We're gonna get into the critique in the next video, which is like the way more complicated one. This one is pretty simplistic comparatively. So let's quickly move into answering topicality and wrap this one up. So similar to theory, once again, we're going to see some of the same arguments. The first is going to be I meet, which as with theory is simply saying, yes, your rule is fine, but I meet that rule, so it doesn't really matter. You can also do this potentially by like comparing like your definitions that they read. But more importantly, we can see definitions come into play in our counter interpretation. So this is going to simply be like your differing definitions. So if you define the same word or words as the one your opponent like defined, and then have a like definition that actually protects your argument, then now your judge has to decide what definition is the best. And obviously, you're going to argue that your definition is the best for whatever reason. Once again, you should also be focusing on inclusivity and exclusivity. That way, it's like very clear what you have to do and also what you cannot do. Otherwise, people are going to argue that you have to like protect everything, and you want to exclude stuff. That way, you don't have to do that. So now we're kind of like shifting based off what is topical, based off of instead now on how much you have to do in order to be topical. So then we're going to move into our standards again, which is essentially saying why your interpretation is better. Most of these are going to come to limits and how it's better for like education or debate or whatever you want to argue. And then you once again move into paradigm issues, just like with answering theory. Once again, technically either side can do this, but it's going to be more effective when answering theory. It essentially tells us how to evaluate the theory debate. So we're going to first like make it clear whenever we have competing interpretations how the theory topicality debate should be decided. Sorry, I said theory earlier. I was definitely thinking of topicality. So the winner of the topicality debate is going to be the person with the best interpretation. So you must prove that you have like the more fair interpretation because that's going to win you the theory debate. And once again, we also see reasonability under here, just like we did with theory, which is essentially to say that like good is good enough. If my counter interpretation is fine, then that means that I should, as a person answering topicality, should win. But it's just like the same type of general idea here that we saw with theory under paradigm issues, and it's really like the least important part, so it's not super important to get into too in depth. It's just kind of like defining how we decide who wins the theory debate or topicality debate, and generally it's going to be saying that even if you don't provide it, like the judge can, kind of like decide themselves because they're the people who obviously decide how like we determine the round in arguments. And even if you tell them like this is how we should decide, that doesn't necessarily mean that's going to be the case. But otherwise, that's topicality. I definitely want to keep this one shorter because, as I stated with theory, there's less about actually just having like a lecture and more going out and doing it yourself and getting more examples. So I'd recommend you, instead of watching this video much longer, take that as your next step. But next we'll go into the critique and give like a good overview of what's going on there. So definitely get ready for that one. But as always, I wish this video was educational and I wish you guys luck in all your rounds.